The Whisper of Water, a Zen story of transformation and deep wisdom. High in the misty mountains, the temple of serene emptiness stood amidst the murmur of the wind and the echo of water flowing through the valleys. The simple yet imposing wooden structure was surrounded by gardens that the monk Tenzō tended to with dedication. Every day, in silence, he swept the fallen leaves from the stone path, lit incense at dawn, and observed the moon's reflection in the temple pond. His life was a ritual of serenity, a silent dance with nature. Since childhood, Tenzō had felt a strange fascination with water. He saw it as a metaphor for existence, always flowing, changing shape, never holding on to anything. But there was one question, a persistent doubt lodged in his heart. It was like a distant echo, resonating deep within him every time the water touched his soul. He couldn't quite formulate it, but it was there, floating in his consciousness like a leaf on the river. Where does the water go when it disappears? He constantly wondered. One morning, as he poured water into his bowl, his master, the elderly Daizan, asked him a question that took his breath away. "Tenzō, tell me, where does the water go when it disappears?" Tenzō gazed at the empty bowl but could not answer. The question, simple yet profound, hung in the air like a leaf that hovers in the air before falling into the water. That night, while meditating by the pond, the murmur of the water seemed to whisper the same question over and over. He realized that it wasn't just curiosity that troubled him, but a feeling of emptiness, as if the answer was always just beyond his reach. Eventually, the doubt transformed into a need, an impulse he could no longer ignore. The search for the answer became his new mission, the journey of understanding. The next day, Tenzō presented himself before Daizan, his face serious and determined. "Master, I need to find the answer." Daizan looked at him calmly, as if knowing this moment would come sooner or later, and nodded slowly. "Then go and listen," he said, pointing to the path that descended through the mist toward the valley. Thus began Tenzō's journey, a journey toward understanding that would take him to distant places, beyond the mountains, beyond the known. In his heart, the question still floated. Where does the water go when it disappears? The Valley of Sowing. Tenzō walked for days, carrying only the essentials in his backpack. Each step was an act of surrender, a yielding to uncertainty, a trust in the flow of the universe. As he descended the mountain, he found himself in a valley covered in rice paddies. The earth seemed to breathe in rhythm with the wind, and the air was thick with the fragrance of fertile soil. There he met a farmer, his face weathered by the sun, working with infinite patience. His bare feet were sunk in the mud, and every movement seemed perfectly in tune with the flow of water. Tenzō watched the farmer's work, astonished by the serenity emanating from him. Unable to contain his doubt any longer, he asked, "Master Farmer, where does the water go when it disappears?" The farmer looked up and smiled, continuing to plant seeds with expert hands. "The water nourishes what it touches. If you don't see it, it's because it has entered the root and become rice, become life." Tenzō reflected deeply on this answer. Was this the response he was searching for? Did the water truly become something new, something invisible to the eyes but present, deep in the earth, nourishing life? He decided to stay a while longer in the valley, helping the farmer. He watched how the water filtered through the furrows, how it disappeared only to reappear in the growing plant. He felt that the answer was near, but still incomplete. The water that nourished life. But how? Where did it hide in the process? What was it that transformed? The forest of transformation. Continuing his journey, Tenzō arrived at an ancient forest where the air smelled of moisture and fertile earth. The shadows of the century-old trees created an atmosphere of perfect peace. There, he met a hermit monk, living alone beneath a great tree, his face covered in wrinkles but with a penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond time. Feeling the same restlessness that had accompanied him, Tenzō asked, "Master Hermit, where does the water go when it disappears?" The old man, unhurried, looked up at the sky and replied, "Look at the clouds. The water rises and hides, but one day it will return as rain." Tenzō gazed at the clouds floating in the sky, white and soft, as if they too were waiting. For several days, he remained in the forest, watching how the rainwater filtered into the ground and ascended again to the tree's leaves. He understood that water never ceases to exist. It only changes its state. It transforms into vapor, into clouds, into rain, into rivers, always returning to its origin, always flowing, always changing. However, he still felt there was something more he needed to understand. The desert of waiting. Tenzō's journey then took him to a vast desert, where golden sands stretched to the horizon. The immensity of the desert was overwhelming, but the silence, deep and profound, offered a strange calm. There he met a Bedouin elder who walked with infinite tranquility, as though the sun and sand could not disturb his serenity. Exhausted by the heat, Tenzō approached him and asked, "Sir, where does the water go when it disappears?" The Bedouin smiled, as if he had been waiting for that question, and pointed to the distant horizon. "The water hides beneath the sand, waiting for the right moment to emerge." Tenzō spent several days in the desert, feeling the thirst in his body, understanding the patience of water. He saw how, occasionally, the desert surrendered to the rains, and how life sprang from the sand in an eternal cycle. He understood that sometimes what we seek is already there, waiting for the right moment to manifest. In that instant, Tenzō realized that water not only flows through time but also through space, and that everything has its time, its moment of appearance. The lesson of the reflection. After many days of travel, Tenzō arrived at a serene lake deep in the valley. There, he found an elderly woman who spent hours gazing at her reflection in the water. The woman was simple, but her presence exuded profound wisdom. Intrigued, Tenzō approached and asked, "Grandmother, what do you see in the water?" The old woman smiled, touched the surface of the lake with her finger, creating small ripples that spread in the calm water. "I see what I was, what I am, and what I will be. But is what you see in the reflection real?" Tenzō gazed at the water, where his own face appeared, distorted by the ripples. In that moment, he understood that the nature of water and life itself is transitory, always in motion. Appearances change constantly, but the essence remains intact. The reflection in the water is not reality, but a manifestation of it. Tenzō understood that water, like life, is a constant flow of transformation, yet never loses its essence. The return to the monastery. Finally, Tenzō returned to the temple, where he found Daizan sweeping the fallen leaves. His master looked at him in silence, without asking anything. Tenzō bowed before him and, with a serene smile, said, "Master, water becomes cloud, life, and sea, but it never ceases to be." Daizan looked at him intently and then pointed to the ground with his staff. "Then tell me, where does the self go when it disappears?" Tenzō gazed at the moon's reflection in the pond. A peaceful smile spread across his face. He understood that, just like water, the self also flows, changes, and dissolves into the vastness of existence. What is lost does not disappear, it only transforms. And in that instant, everything clicked. The final teaching. Years later, Tenzō, now an elderly sage, received a young monk at his temple. The young man, full of questions, approached and asked, "Master, what happens to the water when it disappears?" Tenzō smiled, filled a bowl with water, and poured it slowly onto the ground. Then, pointing to the sky, the river, and the damp earth, he said, "Observe carefully. Only eyes see disappearances, but the water has never gone." The young monk remained silent, watching the earth and water absorb into the sand. At that moment, he understood that the answer had always been present from the beginning, always flowing, always changing, but never disappearing. And so, like water, Tenzō's teachings were passed on, carried by the winds of the centuries, never held, never stopped.